Madeline tightened her grip on the coffee tray, careful not to spill a drop as she entered the conference room filled with polished executives. She was used to being ignored, but she kept her head held high, determined to do her job well. After all, this was her third job of the day, between late-night study sessions and hospital visits for her adoptive mother. The long hours at Preston Enterprises were both a blessing and a burden. Every penny she earned here went to her mother's medical bills and her own future, a future she was determined to carve out on her own terms. But today was different. Today, David Preston himself was in the room. Madeline had seen him from a distance before. The powerful, stone-faced CEO who ran this place. She'd overheard whispers about him, how he could slice through a person with just one cold stare, how he never missed a beat, never showed a hint of weakness. The way people spoke of him, he sounded more like a machine than a man. "Excuse me," she whispered, moving carefully around the long, gleaming table, setting down the coffee cups one by one. As she reached for a cup near David, he glanced up, his gaze sharp and disapproving. She could feel his eyes on her, and just as she was about to step back, he cleared his throat. "Did they pull you off the street?" he remarked dryly, his voice dripping with disdain. "Or do they let just anyone walk in and serve coffee these days?" A few people around the table smirked, while others shifted uncomfortably, clearly used to David's brutal honesty but not necessarily enjoying it. Madeline felt the heat rush to her cheeks, her hands trembling slightly as she steadied herself. "No, sir," she managed, forcing herself to look him in the eye. "I work here. I'm part of the temp team." His eyes narrowed, sizing her up with a look that made her feel smaller than she had in a long time. "Well, then, maybe try to look a bit more respectable, shall we? We are a world-class firm, not a charity." The words hit hard. She bit down on her lip, willing herself not to react, not to show that his comment had landed right in her chest, right where her pride was buried. All she wanted was to finish her task and get out of that room, to escape the judgment that came so easily to people like him. "Understood," she said in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared. She made her way out, back straight, head high, determined not to let him see her break. But the moment she stepped out of the room, she felt the sting of tears pressing against her eyes. She hadn't expected kindness, but she hadn't expected to be humiliated either. "Are you okay?" came a gentle voice behind her. It was Sarah, a friendly receptionist she'd met in the break room during her first week. Sarah's warm brown eyes were filled with concern. Madeline nodded quickly, trying to force a smile. "I'm fine. Just a rough day," Sarah sighed, shaking her head. "Don't let David get to you. He's David. No one ever really pleases him, especially not people he thinks are beneath him." She gave Madeline's shoulder a comforting pat. "Just remember, you're doing this for you, not for him." Madeline took a deep breath and nodded. "Thanks, Sarah. I needed that," as she made her way to the break room to regroup. Her mind was a whirlwind of frustration and determination. She knew she wasn't like the others in that building. She hadn't grown up with luxury or even comfort. She'd grown up learning to fight for every single thing she wanted, and she wasn't about to let one man's contempt knock her off her path. She clenched her fists, feeling a renewed surge of purpose. She would show him. She'd show everyone that she was more than just a girl who served coffee in cheap clothes. Tomorrow, she'd be back, and she'd be stronger. This job was her chance to earn something real, something that would help her and her mother. And she wasn't going to throw it away because of David Preston's cruel words. By the time she walked out of the building that evening, the city lights reflecting on the skyscrapers above, she had managed to steady her resolve. Madeline took a deep breath, glancing back at the towering structure of Preston Enterprises. She was only a speck in that massive machine, an unimportant piece in David Preston's world. But she had dreams of her own, and she would make those dreams come true. No matter who tried to stand in her way, she would prove her worth, not to him, but to herself. Madeline's footsteps echoed softly as she walked down the worn hallway of her apartment building, a place that had been her refuge for as long as she could remember. The peeling paint, the faint smell of old cooking, the distant hum of a TV from someone's room. It was all a part of her world, a world where comfort and luxury were as distant as the stars. But it was a world she had made peace with, even if life here was tough. As she unlocked her door, a familiar warmth greeted her, the The tiny apartment wasn't much, but it was home, and it was here that her mother, Diane, sat in her usual spot by the window, a soft crocheted blanket covering her frail legs. "Hey, Mom," Madeline greeted, her voice softening as she approached the woman who had taken her in and loved her when no one else had. Diane looked up with a gentle smile, her eyes lighting up despite the fatigue that seemed to cling to her like a shadow. "Madeline, honey, how was work?" She asked the same question every day, and though she knew how hard Madeline was working, her voice was always filled with pride. Madeline hesitated, not wanting to share the hurtful details of her day. "It was fine," she said, doing her best to keep her voice light. "Busy as usual, but you know me, just another day in the grind." Diane reached out, taking Madeline's hand and squeezing it gently. "You're so strong, my dear, you've always been that way. Ever since you were a little girl." Diane's voice grew quiet, almost reflective. "It's like there's a fire in you, something that keeps you moving forward no matter what. I'm so proud of you." Madeline forced a smile, feeling a tightness in her chest. She had never told Diane about the humiliation she faced, about how often she felt like an outsider in places like Preston Enterprises. Diane's pride in her was what kept her going, and she couldn't bear to dim that light. As she prepared a simple dinner for the two of them, Madeline's mind drifted back to her childhood. Growing up in an orphanage wasn't easy. She'd been one of dozens of kids, all of them craving love and attention that was hard to come by. And when Diane, a kind but struggling nurse, had taken her in, it felt like she'd been given a second chance. Diane had loved her deeply and unconditionally, and for Madeline, that love was everything. But the hardships had never really ended. Diane's health had begun to deteriorate when Madeline was in high school, and since then, medical bills had piled up. Madeline had taken on jobs, cleaning, waitressing, temp work, anything to keep them afloat. Her education was her one chance at a different life, and she was determined to make it work. "Madeline, don't forget to eat too," Diane said, her voice gentle as she looked at Madeline from across the table. "You work too hard. You need to take care of yourself too." Madeline smiled, sitting down to join her mother. "I will, Mom. Don't worry." They ate together in comfortable silence. With Madeline's thoughts drifting between her past and her future, she knew that every effort she made was to build a better life for both of them. And despite the hurdles, she felt a fierce determination to succeed. Later that evening, as Diane dozed off in her chair, Madeline sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights, her heart heavy yet filled with purpose. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the strength she'd always carried. The next day, she'd return to Preston Enterprises, not for David or his approval, but for herself and her mother, as she closed her eyes. The memories of her childhood surfaced again, the sense of being abandoned, unwanted, and alone, and how that pain had carved a space in her that only Diane's love had managed to fill. The hardships they faced now were nothing compared to what she'd been through before, but the memory of David's scorn lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the sting of his words, the way he'd looked at her as if she were invisible, a nobody. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged based on her appearance or her status, but something about his words felt more personal, like he was challenging everything she had fought to overcome. She was determined to prove him wrong. David Preston didn't know her story, and he certainly didn't know her strength. She would show him, just as she'd shown herself time and time again. And yet, buried beneath that determination, there was a sliver of pain. For years, she'd wondered about her own origins, her real family. She had no memory of them, no trace of where she'd come from, and there were times when that mystery gnawed at her, especially on the toughest days when she felt like she didn't belong anywhere. But tonight, that uncertainty would have to wait. She had a job to keep, bills to pay, and a mother to care for. She couldn't afford to get lost in dreams of a past that might never be uncovered. As she finally slipped into bed, exhaustion pressing down on her, she whispered a silent promise to herself. Tomorrow, she would walk into that office with her head held high. David Preston might see her as someone small and insignificant, but she knew her worth, and one day, so would he. The next morning, Madeline stood in front of the mirror in her small bathroom, staring at her reflection. She took a deep breath, adjusting her simple blouse, trying to smooth out the wrinkles that wouldn't quite disappear. Her clothes were far from the stylish suits and designer pieces worn by her colleagues at Preston Enterprises, but they were clean and presentable. Today, she promised herself, she wouldn't let anything, especially David Preston's arrogance, throw her off course. With one last look, she grabbed her bag, gently kissed her mother on the forehead, and headed out. The subway ride was crowded as usual, a jostling sea of people. But it was her moment to mentally prepare for the day ahead. She repeated a silent mantra. I am here for me. I am strong. I am capable. By the time she walked into the gleaming lobby of Preston Enterprises, she felt her resolve harden. The building's grandeur was both impressive and intimidating, but she reminded herself that she belonged here as much as anyone else. She was determined to finish her tasks, keep her head down, and let her work speak for itself. But as she entered her assigned office space, a few co-workers gave her sympathetic looks, and she couldn't help but wonder if they had overheard David's harsh words the day before. Shake it off, she thought, putting on her best professional expression as she settled into her desk and began organizing paperwork. Sarah, the friendly receptionist, appeared with a knowing smile. Madeline, I didn't think you'd be back today after yesterday's ordeal, she said, lowering her voice to a whisper. Madeline gave a small shrug, trying to downplay it. I can't afford to let people like him get in my head. I'm here to do my job, that's all. Sarah nodded, admiration evident in her eyes. Good for you, but just be careful, okay? David Preston isn't exactly known for showing mercy. Madeline flashed a confident smile. Though deep down, she was anything but certain. Don't worry about me, Sarah. I've handled worse. The morning passed without any sign of David, and for a moment, Madeline dared to hope she could avoid him altogether. She threw herself into her work, sorting through files and making notes, losing herself in the rhythm of productivity. It was almost soothing, a reminder of why she was there, to make a better life for herself and her mother, regardless of what anyone else thought of her. Just as she was starting to relax, she heard the unmistakable sound of David's voice, deep and commanding, filling the hallway outside her office. Her body tensed instinctively, but she forced herself to focus on her task. Stay calm. Don't draw attention. Good morning, everyone, David said, his tone brisk and businesslike as he addressed a group of managers. Let's keep today productive and on track. I expect nothing less than excellence from each of you. She didn't look up as he passed, but she felt the brief flicker of his gaze as it swept over her, pausing for just a moment before moving on. She could almost sense his curiosity, as if he were wondering why she had shown up again, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. As the day wore on, Madeline found herself assigned to more substantial tasks. It was small stuff by the company's standards, but to her, it felt like a step forward. She worked diligently, checking every detail twice, refusing to give anyone an excuse to doubt her competence. During her lunch break, she found a quiet spot outside on a nearby bench. The bustling energy of the city around her reminded her of the vast gap between the life she led and the lives of people like David Preston. For him, wealth and status were as natural as breathing. For her, every small victory was hard-won. When she returned to the office, she was surprised to find a small stack of additional files waiting on her desk. A handwritten note sat on top, scrawled in an unfamiliar but neat handwriting. Make sure these are accurate. DP. Madeline's eyes widened. David himself had assigned her work. She couldn't decide whether it was a compliment or a test, but either way, she took it as a challenge. She spent the next few hours poring over each document, double-checking every figure and entry she didn't want to give him or anyone else. A single reason to look down on her, as the office began to empty out for the day. She finally completed the last file, placing them neatly back in the outbox. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes, exhaustion creeping in, but there was also a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had survived another day, and she'd done it on her own terms. As she gathered her things, Sarah appeared at her desk again, her smile a bit mischievous this time. Rumor has it that David personally handed you some work. That's not something he does for just anyone. Madeline felt a spark of pride but kept her tone casual. I guess he wanted to see if I'd crack under the pressure. Well, if you didn't today, then I doubt you will tomorrow, Sarah replied, giving her a quick hug. Just don't let him get to you. You're stronger than you think. Madeline nodded, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention, but if David wanted to test her, she was more than ready to show him what she was capable of. As she stepped out of the building and into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pulse of determination surge through her. Today had been challenging, but she'd handled it, just as she always had. This was only the beginning. Tomorrow, she would return with the same resolve, ready to face whatever came her way. No matter what David Preston threw at her, she would stand her ground. David sat in his corner office, high above the bustling streets of New York, where the city lights stretched as far as he could see. He leaned back in his chair, a sense of satisfaction washing over him as he reviewed the latest quarterly reports. Preston Enterprises was thriving, growing steadily and securing new markets, and he knew that most of it was thanks to his relentless drive and uncompromising standards. But today, something was tugging at his mind, a small distraction that lingered in the background, refusing to let him focus entirely. He found himself thinking about the young temp, Madeline. Her face had come to him in flashes throughout the day, despite his best efforts to brush it aside. She'd been back at work today, after the harsh comments he'd made the previous morning. Most people would have been intimidated, maybe even humiliated enough to quit. But she hadn't. She'd returned with a quiet determination, her head held high. It was unusual. He'd seen plenty of people break under far less. Yet there she was, handling the tasks he'd left for her with almost unsettling precision. He'd expected a mistake or two, a reason to dismiss her as incapable. But when he reviewed the files she'd worked on, he found them flawless. Each entry meticulously checked and double-checked. David tapped his pen on his desk, annoyed with himself for caring. Why should she matter to him at all? She was just another face, another name that would come and go in the endless rotation of employees. Still, something about her struck him as different. Maybe it was her resilience, or perhaps it was her demeanor, a quiet dignity that seemed incongruous with her background. As he thought about it, he realized that she reminded him vaguely of someone else from a long time ago, someone he'd pushed to the furthest reaches of his mind. With a frustrated sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed the company's human resources department. "Good afternoon, Mr. Preston," came the voice on the other end, polite and crisp. "Yes, hello," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I need some information on one of our temps, Madeline Hayes. Can you send over her file?" There was a brief hesitation. "Certainly, Mr. Preston. I'll have it sent to your office immediately. Thank you." He hung up, realizing he didn't quite know what he was looking for. Background checks on temps weren't typically thorough, just enough to verify basic details. Still, he couldn't shake the curiosity. Moments later, an email appeared on his screen with Madeline's file attached. He opened it, skimming through the details. She'd been raised in a New York orphanage and had no known family. She'd been adopted as a teenager by a nurse named Diane Hayes, and had since worked her way through several jobs, all while pursuing her education. No college degree yet, though it seemed she was putting herself through night classes. David felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. A girl who'd come from nothing, fighting for a life she could barely afford. It was a story he'd heard before in various forms, but somehow this felt different. As much as he tried to ignore it, there was something strangely familiar about her background, something that stirred a long-buried memory. Against his better judgment, he searched through his desk until he found a small, faded photo, one he rarely looked at. It was a photo of his daughter, Anna, taken just before the accident. She'd been a baby, barely old enough to smile for the camera. His fingers traced the edges of the picture, the memory of her tiny face, her bright eyes, flooding back to him. His heart ached with a heaviness he hadn't felt in years. Setting the photo down, he leaned back, trying to shake off the wave of emotion. Anna had been gone for years, he reminded himself. Any hope of finding her had disappeared long ago. But as he looked back at Madeline's file, he couldn't ignore the whisper of doubt that crept into his mind. It was ridiculous, he told himself. An absurd thought, But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a reason he felt so drawn to this girl. In an uncharacteristic moment of impulse, he picked up his phone again, this time dialing the number of a private investigator he'd worked with before. "Mr. Preston," the investigator's voice answered smoothly. "How can I help you? I have a small job for you." David replied, trying to keep his tone indifferent, though his curiosity was palpable. I need you to look into the background of someone named Madeline Hayes. She works here at Preston Enterprises as a temp. I'd like to know everything you can find about her past. Where she came from, who she's connected to. The investigator paused, clearly surprised. Understood, Mr. Preston. I'll begin immediately. Good. Keep this discreet, David added, his voice firm. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, if there was anything to find at all, but he needed to satisfy his own curiosity. To put this strange fascination to rest, after hanging up, he glanced at the photo of Anna one last time before returning it to his drawer. It was impossible, of course, he told himself, and yet, that impossibility was what made him want answers even more. There was something about Madeline, something that tugged at a place in his heart he'd thought had been long closed off. The rest of his day was filled with meetings and emails, his usual tasks that required focus and attention. But every so often, he found his mind drifting back to Madeline, wondering if his instincts were leading him somewhere unexpected. As evening settled in, he left the office, his thoughts still lingering on the mystery he'd just set into motion. Madeline had managed to push her way into his carefully controlled world, whether she knew it or not, and now, he was determined to figure out why. David leaned back in his leather chair, the shadows of his office stretching across the room as the evening settled in. The flickering city lights outside seemed like a distant world, one he controlled from his high-rise throne. Yet, tonight, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that clung to him, an unfamiliar sensation that made him restless. He reached into his desk drawer, pulling out the small faded photograph of his daughter, Anna. It was the only picture he had of her, a snapshot of a life that had been taken from him far too soon. She'd been just a baby, bundled up in soft blankets, her tiny hands reaching out as if she wanted to grasp the world. David had spent years burying the pain, pouring himself into work, building his empire, and convincing himself that he'd moved on. But in moments like this, when the world was quiet and he was alone, the ache resurfaced, sharper than ever. The grief was something he carried silently, a wound he'd never let anyone see. He placed the photo back in the drawer and shut it, as if closing off the part of him that still yearned for a daughter he would never know. And yet, as he thought of Madeline, that stubborn young woman who had returned to work despite his harsh words, he felt an odd flicker of familiarity, the look in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her bearing. It reminded him of someone. Shaking his head, he reminded himself that Madeline was just another employee, a temporary fixture in his world. But even as he tried to convince himself, a nagging doubt crept in, a whisper in the back of his mind. Could it really be possible? The private investigator he'd hired hadn't called back yet, but David knew the man was thorough. If there was anything unusual about Madeline's past, he would uncover it. For now, David had to wait, and he hated waiting. The next day, he arrived at the office early, as usual, his mind already racing with the day's tasks. But as he walked past the break room, he caught a glimpse of Madeline sitting alone at a small table, her head bowed as she sipped a cup of coffee. She looked tired, worn down, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. For a brief moment, he considered approaching her, perhaps to apologize or offer a word of encouragement. But old habits held him back. David Preston didn't apologize. He didn't reach out or show weakness, especially not to someone so far beneath him in status. And yet, as he watched her, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar, an ache that went beyond simple curiosity. Mr. Preston, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was his assistant, a young man with a clipboard and an expectant look. The meeting with the board is ready for you. David nodded, tearing his gaze away from Madeline and pushing the strange emotions back down where they belonged. Focus, he reminded himself. Stay on course, throughout the day. He buried himself in his work, the usual string of meetings and negotiations filling his schedule. But the memory of Madeline lingered at the edges of his mind, a constant distraction he couldn't seem to shake. By evening, he found himself growing impatient, waiting for a call from the investigator. Finally, as he was about to leave the office, his phone buzzed. It was the investigator. "Mr. Preston," the man said, his voice calm and professional. "I've gathered some information on Madeline Hayes as you requested." David felt a rush of anticipation. "Go on. She was indeed raised in an orphanage here in New York, the investigator began. No records of any family, biological or otherwise, before her adoption by Diane Hayes. From what I've gathered, Diane Hayes took her in at the age of 12. She's been working various jobs since high school to support both herself and her adoptive mother, who has been in poor health. David's fingers tapped against his desk. Processing the information, none of this was particularly surprising. He'd already known some of it from her file, but he wanted more, something that would confirm or deny the strange feeling in his gut. Is there anything unusual? David pressed, his voice sharper than intended. The investigator hesitated. There's one detail that stood out, sir. Madeline was found as an infant, abandoned near a hospital entrance. She was taken in by child services and later placed in the orphanage. There's no record of her birth parents, no trace of where she came from before that. David's pulse quickened, a mix of hope and fear stirring within him. And you're certain of this? Yes, sir, I double-checked all available records, the investigator confirmed. She has no known family. David's mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions he hadn't felt in years. Could this really be Anna? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. If she was his daughter, he had unknowingly pushed her away, humiliated her, dismissed her as nothing. The weight of that realization settled heavily on him, making it hard to breathe. Thank you, he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. After ending the call, David sat alone in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place. Madeline's resilience, her strength. It was as if he were seeing a reflection of himself. The same drive, the same determination. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know the truth. David took a deep breath, his mind made up. He would do whatever it took to confirm his suspicions. If there was even a chance that Madeline was Anna, he owed it to both of them to find out. And if she was truly his daughter, he knew he had a mountain of regrets to climb. For now, he would continue watching her, looking for clues, hoping that somewhere along the way, he would find the answer he so desperately needed. But one thing was certain. This girl, this young woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly, was changing everything. As he locked up his office and headed out into the night, he felt a strange sense of purpose, one he hadn't felt in years. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. And if she truly was Anna, he would do everything in his power to make things right. The next morning, Madeline entered Preston Enterprises with her usual resolve. Though a part of her was bracing for whatever new challenge the day might bring, her interaction with David Preston had left a sour taste. But her determination to stay and make a difference was stronger than any humiliation. She focused on her tasks, keeping her head down and doing her best to stay invisible. But to her surprise, as the day progressed, she noticed David passing by her desk more than once, each time with a slight pause, almost as if he were observing her. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, but after the third time, she began to feel unnerved. Was he scrutinizing her work, looking for a mistake? She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the files that had been piling up, until, around mid-morning, David stopped directly at her desk. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone noticeably more neutral than it had been before. "May I have a word?" Madeline's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing with questions. She forced herself to remain calm, nodding as she followed him into his office. It was a vast space, cold and immaculate, with an entire wall of windows overlooking the city skyline. She'd been inside before, delivering files or coffee, but she'd never been invited in for an actual conversation. David gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit," she complied, trying to hide her apprehension. He watched her carefully, as if studying her face for something hidden beneath the surface. She held his gaze, unwilling to appear weak or intimidated, though his intense scrutiny made her feel as if he could see right through her. "I want to talk about your work here," he began, his voice calm but laced with an intensity she hadn't expected. "You've been handling a significant amount of responsibility for a temp. It's clear you're capable and determined." Madeline felt a flash of pride, but she kept her tone measured. "Thank you, Mr. Preston. I appreciate the opportunity." He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I've also noticed your resilience. You returned after what I'd call a rather challenging first day." His voice softened slightly, though his expression remained serious. Not everyone would have handled that so well. Madeline's chest tightened. Was this his way of apologizing? She couldn't be sure, but his words felt sincere, and that alone was unexpected. "I didn't come here to quit, Mr. Preston," she replied evenly. "I have a goal, and I'm willing to work hard to achieve it." A flicker of something crossed his face, something that looked almost like respect. "And what is that goal?" he asked, his voice quiet. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I want to make a better life for myself and my mother. She's everything to me, and I want to make her proud." For the briefest moment, she saw a shadow of empathy in his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual stoic expression, but she could have sworn it had been there. "I respect that," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You remind me of someone I used to know, a person who fought for every scrap of success he achieved." She arched an eyebrow, surprised. "I wouldn't have thought you had to fight for anything, Mr. Preston." He almost smiled, a hint of amusement breaking through his cold exterior. "I didn't always sit in a corner office, Ms. Hayes. Once upon a time, I had to earn my place in this world." They sat in silence for a moment, each taking the other's measure. Madeline felt a strange sense of connection, as if she were seeing a glimpse of a different side of David Preston, one hidden beneath years of power and privilege. She found herself softening slightly, though she didn't fully trust his intentions. "Anyway," he said, clearing his throat, "I've decided to reassign you to a more permanent role within the company. Should you be interested, it would come with more responsibility and a bit more pay." Madeline's eyes widened. This was more than she'd expected, and she had to restrain herself from expressing outright gratitude. "I'd be honored, Mr. Preston. I won't let you down." He nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good. You'll be working directly under my supervision, assisting with reports, client communications, and other projects. I expect nothing less than excellence." "Of course," she replied, her voice steady as she stood to leave. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Ms. Hayes, Madeline," he said, a faint softness in his tone. "If you ever need anything, my door is open." The offer caught her off guard, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. She nodded, mumbling a quick, "Thank you." "Sir," before making her way out of the office, her mind whirling with questions. Over the next few days, Madeline's work shifted significantly. David assigned her a series of projects, each more complex than the last, and though the tasks were challenging, she welcomed them. It was a chance to prove herself, and she poured every ounce of her energy into each assignment. Their interactions became more frequent, and though David remained professional, there were moments when he seemed almost protective. He would stop by her desk, offering quiet feedback or encouragement, and Madeline found herself beginning to feel a strange sense of security in his presence. One evening, as they wrapped up a particularly grueling project, David surprised her by asking about her life outside of work. She hesitated, but eventually shared bits and pieces about her past, her time in the orphanage, her love for her mother, the struggles she'd faced along the way. David listened intently, his face inscrutable, but his eyes softened, as if he were seeing her in a new light. She, in turn, was beginning to see him differently. Beneath the cold exterior, she sensed a man who had known his own struggles, his own heartbreaks. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to David Preston than the ruthless CEO everyone whispered about. As their work relationship deepened, so did the growing sense of connection between them. It was unspoken, barely noticeable, but it was there, a thread that seemed to draw them closer, binding them in ways neither fully understood. Madeline didn't know why David had taken such a sudden interest in her life, but as the days passed, she found herself wondering if, just maybe, she'd stumbled upon something she'd been searching for all her life, a place to belong, a person who truly saw her. And though David wouldn't admit it, he felt something too, a glimmer of hope that this young woman, this determined soul who reminded him so much of himself, might be the key to healing the part of his heart he thought he'd lost forever. David's days became a mixture of business as usual and an ever-growing intrigue over the mystery that was Madeline Hayes. As the two continued to work together, he found himself torn between his professional demeanor and an inexplicable desire to uncover the truth about her. Each glance, Every bit of information he learned about her past seemed to stir a deeper memory he couldn't quite grasp. One afternoon, while David was deep in thought at his desk, his phone rang, the name of his private investigator flashing on the screen. He answered quickly, his voice firm but laced with a barely concealed tension. "Yes, what do you have?" "Mr. Preston," the investigator replied, his tone as professional as ever. "I've been looking into every angle I could find regarding Madeline Hayes' background. I did uncover something unusual, though it's not exactly a smoking gun." David's heart raced. "Go on," he said, his voice a bit sharper than intended. The investigator paused briefly before continuing. "Madeline was found as an infant. As I mentioned before, there was no information on her biological family, no records of birth parents, but I managed to retrieve an old document from the orphanage where she was placed. It notes that the infant was found wearing a bracelet engraved with the initials AP. David froze, the breath catching in his throat. AP. Anna Preston. Those were the initials he'd engraved on a small bracelet for his daughter the day she was born. He'd insisted on it, wanting her to have a piece of her family. A connection to the Preston name, even if it was a simple trinket. "Are you certain?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir, it's not much, but it's the only identifying detail tied to her when she was found," the investigator confirmed. "If it's true, then Madeline Hayes might indeed be. Well, you know the implications." David's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic mix of hope, guilt, and a flicker of disbelief. He thanked the investigator quickly and hung up, leaning back in his chair as he tried to process what he'd just heard. It was almost too much to hope for, yet the evidence was piling up, hint by hint, as if leading him to a truth he'd long given up on. Madeline might be Anna, his Anna, the daughter he'd lost, the child he'd believed was gone forever, and if that were true, then he'd unknowingly been harsh, cold, even cruel to her, dismissing her as just another temporary employee when she was. In fact, his own flesh and blood, David felt the weight of regret pressing down on him. Memories of his past behavior flooded back. Every stern word, every look of dismissal, every moment he'd overlooked her as if she were invisible. The enormity of his mistake was nearly overwhelming. How had he let his own grief and ambition cloud his ability to see her? But he knew he needed to be certain. For as much as his heart wanted to believe, he needed concrete proof, and there was only one way to get that. The following day, he called Madeline into his office, his demeanor carefully controlled. She entered with her usual quiet confidence, a hint of curiosity in her eyes as she stood before his desk. "Mr. Preston," she asked, her voice steady yet respectful. "Please sit," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. Once she was seated, he took a deep breath, his hands clasped together on the desk. "Madeline, I have a rather unusual request. I realize this may seem out of place, but I need you to trust me." She looked at him, her brows furrowing slightly. "What is it, Mr. Preston?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like to conduct a DNA test. I realize that may sound strange, but it's for personal reasons. I suspect that you and I may share a connection that goes beyond this office." Madeline's eyes widened, her confusion apparent. I'm not sure I understand. Why would you want to do a DNA test with me?" David's gaze softened, the hint of vulnerability in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. "It's complicated, Madeline, for years. I believed I'd lost someone dear to me, someone who vanished without a trace. But after getting to know you, there are too many coincidences, too many pieces that fit." She stared at him, processing his words. "You think I could be someone you lost?" Her voice wavered slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. David nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I know it sounds unbelievable, and I'm asking a lot, but this is the only way to know for certain." Madeline was silent for a long moment, her mind spinning. She'd spent her entire life wondering about her origins, piecing together fragments of her past that seemed to lead nowhere. The idea that this man, this powerful, distant man who had seemed so far removed from her life, could be connected to her by blood was surreal. Finally, she nodded, her voice soft. "All right, I'll do it." David felt a surge of relief, though he kept his emotions in check. "Thank you, Madeline. We'll arrange it discreetly, and no one else needs to know." They agreed on the details. And she left his office, her thoughts a whirlwind of questions and emotions she couldn't yet process. As she returned to her desk, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. Part of her longed to know the truth, to finally uncover the mystery of her past. But another part was wary of what it might mean. Could David Preston really be the father she'd never known? In the days that followed, she tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept returning to the idea, the possibility that the truth about her origins might finally be within reach. She wondered if she should feel anger, sadness, or even hope. The unknown stretched before her, and she realized that this discovery would change everything, for better or for worse. When the results finally arrived, David received them first. His heart pounded as he opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the page until he saw the confirmation he both feared and longed for. The test was positive. Madeline was his daughter, Anna. In that instant, a torrent of emotions washed over him. Joy, regret, shame. He had his daughter back, the child he thought he'd lost forever. But she was no longer a child. She was a grown woman who had faced life's hardships alone, while he had buried himself in wealth and success. Believing she was gone, he knew he had to make amends, to explain, to beg her forgiveness if that's what it took. He couldn't erase the past, but he could try to build a future with her, a future that might heal the wounds they both carried. Summoning his courage, he called her back into his office, the weight of the revelation heavy on his shoulders. When she walked in, he looked at her with a mixture of love, regret, and determination. This was his chance to make things right, to finally give her the family she deserved. As she sat down, he took a deep breath, his voice trembling with emotion. "Madeline, I have the results, and it's true, you are my daughter." Her reaction was a mix of shock, disbelief, and a raw vulnerability she'd never shown before. In that moment, David realized that this was only the beginning of a journey that would test them both in ways they had yet to imagine. Madeline sat frozen in David's office, her mind barely able to process the words she had just heard. "You are my daughter." The phrase echoed in her mind, each repetition bringing with it a surge of emotions she couldn't untangle. Shock, disbelief, anger, and a small, fragile flicker of hope. David sat across from her, watching her reaction with a vulnerability she had never seen before. This wasn't the cold, calculating CEO who had dismissed her with cutting words. This was a man who looked almost broken, as if the weight of his own actions were pressing down on him. "Madeline," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this must be overwhelming. I can't imagine what you must be feeling right now. But I need you to know that if I had any idea that you were my daughter, I would have done everything differently." She stared at him, the words landing hollow against the storm inside her. "So, you're saying I'm Anna, the daughter you thought you'd lost?" David nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes, Anna was the name we gave you when you were born. I thought you'd died in that accident. I spent years searching, holding on to every scrap of hope. But eventually, I had to accept that you were gone. And when you walked into this building, He stopped, his voice breaking. "I didn't see it. I couldn't see it." Madeline's throat tightened. She didn't know whether to feel anger or pity, whether to lash out or forgive. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to make him understand what it had been like growing up in an orphanage, bouncing between foster homes, feeling like a forgotten person in a world that never stopped moving. And then, Diane had entered her life, filling a void with the love only a mother could offer. Diane had been her everything. "Do you have any idea what my life has been like?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "While you were here, building this empire, I was out there, barely surviving. I had to fight for everything. I didn't even know my own name. I didn't know you existed, that anyone cared enough to wonder where I was." David's face contorted with pain, and he clasped his hands together, his knuckles turning white. "I can't change that," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I know I can't erase the years of pain, the years you spent alone, but I want to try, Madeline. I want to give you the life you deserved from the beginning. Let me make this right." Madeline looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. She wanted to reject him, to walk out of that office and out of his life forever. But there was a part of her, a small but undeniable part, that yearned for the family she had always missed, the family she thought she'd never have. "What about Diane?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "She's the one who raised me, who was there for me when no one else was. She's my mother, even if she isn't, even if she didn't give birth to me." David nodded, his face filled with understanding. "I know, and I'm not here to replace her, or to take away what you two share. I know she's been your family, and I respect that. I'm grateful for what she did for you. But I want the chance to be part of your life, to be the father I should have been from the start." Madeline's mind whirled with the weight of his words, the unspoken promise they carried. She had spent so much of her life dreaming about her origins, wondering who she was and where she came from. And now, sitting in front of the man who had unknowingly caused her so much pain, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. "How am I supposed to trust you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You've treated me like nothing, like I didn't matter. How am I supposed to believe that this is real?" David's eyes filled with regret, his shoulders slumping as if carrying the weight of her pain. "I can't change how I acted before, and I won't try to justify it. But I can tell you that every word I said to you, every mistake I made, it was because I didn't know. I was blinded by my own grief and arrogance, and I see now that I was wrong." He leaned forward, his gaze meeting hers with a sincerity that took her by surprise. "Madeline or Anna, whatever name you choose to go by, I am here to make this right. I want to earn your trust. If you'll let me, I know it won't be easy, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I am truly your father." Madeline's heart twisted with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to believe him, to open herself up to the possibility of family, of belonging. But another part, a darker, more cynical part, whispered that he was only saying these things because he felt guilty, because he wanted to ease his own conscience. She took a shaky breath, wiping away the tear that had escaped. I need time," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to think about this, to figure out what it all means. You've spent 18 years without me. I think I deserve a little time to decide if I want you in my life." David nodded, his expression one of quiet acceptance. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, ready whenever you are. Just know that whatever you decide, I will respect it. I want what's best for you, Madeline. That's all I've ever wanted." She rose slowly, feeling the weight of the conversation settle into her bones. This was a truth she had dreamed of and dreaded, all in the same breath. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. Then, without looking back, she walked out of his office, leaving David alone with his thoughts. As she made her way down the hall, she felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, like she was finally breaking free from the mystery of her past, but losing a part of herself in the process. She needed time, yes. But more than that, she needed to find out who she was beyond all of this. Beyond the orphan, beyond the struggling young woman, beyond Anna Preston, she needed to find herself. Independent of the world that David Preston had created, and David, sitting alone in his office, knew he had a long road ahead of him. He had spent years burying his grief and building walls, and now those walls had to come down, piece by painful piece. He was prepared to wait, to prove his love, to earn her forgiveness. And he knew that, whatever it took, he would fight for his daughter, the one person he had always loved, even in her absence. They were both left to confront the enormity of the truth and the uncertain path that lay ahead, a journey that would test them both and perhaps, in time, bring them closer together. Madeline felt as if she were floating through a dream as she walked back to her desk, her mind spinning from the revelation. David Preston was her father. The thought didn't seem real, even as the truth settled deeper with each step she took. She could still hear his words, his voice laced with regret, and something that resembled love. But love, could she believe in that? The man who had humiliated her in front of her colleagues, who had dismissed her without a second thought, was he capable of love? Or was this newfound tenderness only guilt, his way of trying to correct years of neglect? She sank into her chair, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to refocus on her tasks. Yet her mind refused to cooperate, the questions and emotions swirling in her head like a storm. For so long, she had wondered about her past, about the family she never knew, but the reality was so different from anything she'd imagined. David hadn't just been absent from her life. He'd been the very person who made her feel small, made her feel like she had to prove herself worthy, and now he wanted her forgiveness. As the hours passed, she found herself growing restless. She couldn't concentrate on her work, couldn't stop the racing thoughts. Finally, unable to bear the weight of it alone, she picked up her phone and called Diane, the one person who had always been there, who had loved her without condition or question. Madeline. Diane's voice was warm, comforting, the way it always was. "How's work, sweetheart?" Madeline swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "Mom, I need to talk to you. There's something I found out today, and I don't know what to do. Is everything all right?" Diane's tone shifted, laced with concern. "Are you in trouble?" "No, it's not that," Madeline said, trying to find the words. "It's about my past, my biological family." There was a brief pause before Diane replied, her voice gentle. "Go on." "Honey, I'm here. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Madeline took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I found out who my father is. It turns out, he's my boss, David Preston." Diane's silence stretched over the line, and for a moment, Madeline wondered if she'd lost connection. But then Diane spoke, her voice calm but filled with a quiet shock. "David Preston, the man who owns the company you work for." "Yes," Madeline replied, feeling a wave of emotions crash over her. He thought I was dead. He didn't know I'd survived. And now that he knows, he's asking for forgiveness, saying he wants to make things right." "Oh, honey," Diane whispered, a mixture of sadness and empathy in her voice. "That's a lot to take in. I can only imagine how overwhelming this must be for you." "I don't know what to do," Madeline confessed, her voice breaking. "Part of me wants to believe him, to let him in, but another part wants to hold on to the anger, the hurt. He was so awful to me, Mom. He made me feel like I was nothing." Diane sighed softly, her voice filled with understanding. "Madeline, it's natural to feel conflicted. You've lived your whole life without him, and now he's asking to be part of it. But forgiveness isn't about erasing the pain. It's about giving yourself peace. Maybe it's worth hearing him out, seeing if he's truly willing to change." Madeline listened, letting Diane's words settle within her. Diane was right. Holding on to the anger might feel justified, but it wouldn't give her the closure she needed. She realized that this wasn't just about David. It was about her journey, her chance to finally heal. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, her voice steadier. I think I need to give him a chance. For my own sake." Diane's voice was filled with warmth and pride. "Whatever you decide, Madeline, I'll be here for you. You've been through so much, but you're stronger than you know. And no matter what happens, you'll always have me." Madeline smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I know, and that means the world to me." They talked a little longer, Diane offering words of encouragement and love, reminding Madeline that she didn't have to make any decisions immediately when the call ended. Madeline felt a renewed sense of clarity. She knew that her next step had to be confronting David, laying out the pain she'd carried for so long, and seeing if he could truly understand. The following day, she requested a meeting with him, her heart pounding as she approached his office. When she entered, David rose from his desk, his expression tense, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Madeline," he began, his voice filled with apprehension. "Thank you for coming." She took a seat across from him, steeling herself. "I needed to talk to you. I needed to tell you what this has been like for me." David nodded, his gaze focused solely on her, as if he knew that whatever she was about to say, he needed to hear it. "You asked me to forgive you," she started, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But forgiveness isn't that simple. I spent my whole life not knowing who I was, wondering why I didn't have a family. I grew up thinking I was unwanted, unworthy. And then, when I came here, you treated me like I was nothing, like I was less than everyone else." David's face tightened, a flash of pain crossing his eyes. "I can't tell you how sorry I am, Madeline. I wish I could go back, change the way I treated you. If I'd known, if I had any idea, but you didn't," she interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't know. And maybe that's part of the problem. You couldn't see past your own pain, your own expectations. You were so focused on what you'd lost that you couldn't see what was right in front of you." David swallowed hard, his eyes filled with regret. "You're right. I was blind, Madeline. I was so wrapped up in my grief that I pushed everyone away. I let my own bitterness control me, and I lost the chance to be there for you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past heavy between them. Madeline took a deep breath, her heart softening as she saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice quiet, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give you a chance to show me that you're more than the man who pushed me away." David's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Thank you, Madeline. That's more than I deserve, but it's all I could hope for. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll be here, every step of the way, if you'll let me." She nodded, a small, tentative smile forming on her lips. "I think that's a start." As she left his office, Madeline felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The road to healing wouldn't be easy, but she had taken the first step. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive David, but she was willing to let him try, to see if he could be the father she had always needed. And David, watching her walk away, knew that this was his second chance, a chance to finally be the father he should have been, to earn her trust and, maybe one day, her forgiveness. Madeline spent the days following her conversation with David in a haze of reflection and uncertainty. The revelation that David was her father had shifted the entire foundation of her life, and she still struggled to reconcile the many layers of emotion that it stirred within her. Anger, sadness, curiosity, and a strange, tentative hope. All these feelings mingled together, leaving her unsure of which to trust. Yet, Diane's words echoed in her mind. Forgiveness is about giving yourself peace. She knew that holding on to resentment would only keep her trapped in the pain of the past. If she wanted to move forward, she needed to decide whether David could truly be a part of her life. But that choice felt enormous, almost too big to make alone. So, one Saturday morning, she took a walk through Central Park, letting the peaceful scenery and fresh air calm her restless thoughts. The city's noise faded in the background as she wandered along the paths, searching for clarity. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of her strength, of everything she had survived. The truth was, Madeline had always been strong. She had learned to stand on her own, to fight for her future with a tenacity that few could match. And now, as she thought of David, she realized that he was a part of that journey. As much as she wanted to deny it, he was her father, a part of her history and her identity. She stopped at a bench near the lake. Sitting down and watching the calm water, in her heart, she knew what she wanted: to give him a chance, to try and find a place for him in her life. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. When Monday arrived, she entered Preston Enterprises with a renewed sense of purpose. She would speak to David, not as his employee, but as his daughter. She found him in his office, his gaze softening as he looked up and saw her standing at the door. "Madeline," he greeted, his tone tentative but warm. "Please, come in." She took a seat across from him, her posture relaxed, yet her eyes held a determination that David hadn't seen before. "I've made a decision," she began, her voice steady. He watched her, anticipation flickering in his expression. "I'm listening." Madeline took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I want to give this a chance, to build a relationship with you. But I need you to understand something. This won't be easy for me. I can't just forget the past or ignore the way things have been between us. If we're going to move forward, it has to be real. No more apologies that don't mean anything. No more grand gestures, just honesty." David's expression softened, and he nodded, his voice filled with sincerity. "I understand. Madeline, I don't expect you to forget or forgive overnight. I know I have a lot to prove, and I'm willing to put in the work, whatever it takes." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past slowly dissipating. making room for something new, something fragile but hopeful. Madeline leaned back in her chair, relaxing slightly. I also want you to know that Diane will always be a part of my life. She raised me, and nothing will ever change that. David nodded, his gaze respectful. I wouldn't dream of taking that away from you. Diane is your mother in every way that matters, and I'm grateful she was there for you when I wasn't. She appreciated the humility in his words. The way he acknowledged Diane's role without defensiveness or jealousy. It made her feel like maybe, just maybe, he truly understood. So, where do we start? She asked, feeling a bit uncertain but willing to take the leap. David's eyes brightened, a hint of excitement breaking through his usually stoic expression. We start wherever you want, Madeline. If you'd like, I could show you a bit more of my world, let you see the parts of my life I've kept hidden. Or, we could keep it simple. Lunch, maybe. Madeline smiled, a small but genuine smile. Lunch sounds good. Let's start there. They decided on a casual place nearby, a quiet cafe where they could talk without the formalities of the office. As they walked side by side through the city streets, Madeline couldn't help but feel the surrealness of it all. Just weeks ago, she'd been a temp in his company, enduring his scorn. Now, she was here with him, trying to build a bridge over the divide that years of distance and misunderstanding had created. Over lunch, their conversation was slow and careful at first, with both of them feeling out the boundaries, unsure of where they stood. But as the minutes passed, the tension began to ease. David shared stories about his life, his career, and some of the struggles he'd faced, pieces of himself that he rarely showed to anyone. Madeline listened, intrigued by the glimpses of vulnerability she saw in him. She could tell that he was trying, genuinely trying, to connect, to show her the man behind the powerful exterior. And as much as she wanted to guard her heart, she couldn't deny the flicker of warmth she felt as he spoke. In turn, she shared stories of her own, her years in the orphanage, her first memories of Diane, and the challenges she'd faced growing up. She didn't hold back, letting him see the raw truth of her life, her struggles, and her triumphs. And as she spoke, she saw a deep sadness in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the years he had missed. By the time they finished their meal, a tentative bond had begun to form, fragile yet real. They both knew it would take time, that the scars of the past wouldn't fade easily. But for the first time, Madeline felt a glimmer of possibility, a sense that perhaps they could build something meaningful from the broken pieces. As they walked back to the office, David turned to her, his expression earnest. Thank you, Madeline, for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I promise I won't take it for granted. She looked at him, feeling a quiet strength within her. It's a start, David. That's all I can offer right now. But I think that's enough. They exchanged a smile, a moment of mutual understanding passing between them. They still had a long way to go, but they were finally on the path together. As Madeline returned to her desk, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She was no longer defined by the mysteries of her past. She had found answers, closure, and the beginnings of a new relationship that might one day become something more. David watched her from his office, a soft smile on his face. For the first time in years, he felt hope that he could rebuild, that he could be the father she deserved. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew the road would be full of challenges, but he was willing to do whatever it took. They had taken the first step, and that was enough. Madeline sat by the window in her small apartment that evening, the city lights twinkling outside, casting a warm glow that matched the gentle warmth in her chest. It had been a day of revelations, hard conversations, and fragile first steps, but somehow, it felt like she had shed an invisible weight. For the first time in her life, she felt like she knew where she came from. She understood the pieces of herself that had always seemed like mysteries, and even more, she'd glimpsed the possibility of family. The following days passed in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. She and David began meeting regularly, starting with casual lunches that soon evolved into deeper conversations. Slowly, a routine emerged, a steady, careful rhythm of building something new out of fragments of the past. David didn't push or pressure. He let her set the pace, a gesture she appreciated more than she could express. One afternoon, he surprised her with an invitation to his home, a place she'd only heard about through office gossip. She hesitated, but eventually, Her curiosity won out when she arrived. She found herself at the entrance of an elegant yet surprisingly warm space, filled with understated decor and personal touches that spoke of a life both successful and private. "Welcome," David said, his smile cautious yet hopeful as he led her into the living room. "I wanted you to see where I live, to show you more of who I am beyond the office." She looked around, taking in the framed photographs on the walls, pictures of landscapes, friends, moments from his life that hinted at stories she hadn't heard yet. But one photo, in particular, caught her eye. It was an old, slightly faded photograph of a woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile, holding a baby wrapped in a soft blanket. "That's my mother?" she asked, feeling a pang of longing as she looked at the image. David nodded, his voice filled with quiet reverence. "Yes, that's your mother, Elizabeth. She was the heart of everything good in my life. Losing her and you at the same time, it was almost more than I could bear." Madeline reached out, her fingers brushing the frame, feeling a strange connection to a woman she'd never known, but who had given her life. The ache in her heart softened slightly, replaced by a gentle warmth. She couldn't explain it, but somehow, she felt her mother's presence, as if Elizabeth's love had been waiting all these years. Guiding her home, they sat together in the living room, David sharing stories about Elizabeth, about the dreams they'd had for Anna, dreams that had been cut short by tragedy. Madeline listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of grief and gratitude. These were pieces of her past that had been missing. And each story, each memory, felt like a thread stitching her life together in a way that finally made sense. In the weeks that followed, David continued to open up, showing her glimpses of himself that he had kept hidden from everyone, even his closest friends. She saw his regrets, his triumphs, and his unwavering determination to make up for lost time. He wasn't perfect, but he was genuine, and for the first time, Madeline began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could be a family. Then, one evening, she received a call from David, his voice filled with a quiet excitement. "Madeline, I have something I'd like to show you. It's important. Could you meet me in the office?" Curious and a bit nervous, she agreed, making her way to Preston Enterprises. When she arrived, David was waiting for her in the lobby, a gentle smile on his face as he led her up to the executive floor. She followed him into a small, private conference room, where a modest wooden box sat on the table. "What's this?" she asked, glancing at him. Intrigued, David looked at her, his expression soft. "This is for you. I've been thinking a lot about everything you went through, the life you had to build from nothing. You deserve so much more than just my apologies." He lifted the lid of the box, revealing an assortment of documents and papers. Madeline's eyes widened as she realized what they were. Property deeds, stock shares, bank information, all assets that David had gathered over the years. "Madeline," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "I want you to have this. Consider it a start, a foundation for the life you've worked so hard for. You don't have to accept it if it doesn't feel right. But this is my way of trying to give back even a small part of what I owe you." Madeline stared at the documents, her heart pounding. She felt a rush of gratitude, but also a quiet hesitation. This was more than she'd ever dreamed of, a tangible sign of David's commitment to her, his desire to make amends. Yet, it wasn't the material wealth that moved her. It was his gesture, the sincerity behind it that made her heart soften. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "But more than this, I just want to know that you'll be there, that we'll keep building something real." David's eyes shone with emotion, and he nodded. "I promise, Madeline. I'll be here, for as long as you'll have me. You're my daughter, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much you mean to me." As they stood there, a new bond forged between them. Madeline felt a sense of peace settle over her. It hadn't been an easy journey, and there were still scars that would take time to heal. But she had found something she thought she'd lost forever, a place where she belonged, a family, in the months that followed. Madeline and David continued to grow closer, each step bringing them closer to the relationship they both craved. There were hard days filled with misunderstandings and memories that couldn't be erased. But there were also moments of laughter, shared dinners, and quiet conversations that mended the broken parts of their lives. Diane remained a central part of Madeline's life, the mother who had raised her and taught her strength, and David respected that bond, knowing that Diane's love had sustained his daughter when he couldn't. Together, they became a unique family, one that defied expectations but worked in its own imperfect way. One evening, as they gathered for dinner in David's home, Madeline looked around the table, seeing the faces of those who had shaped her journey. She realized, with a deep sense of gratitude, that she was finally home. For David, the years of regret and solitude had given way to a new purpose, loving and supporting the daughter he had thought he'd lost. And for Madeline, the search for identity and belonging had come full circle, revealing a strength and resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Their journey wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't always be easy, but together, they were ready to face whatever came next, knowing that, at long last, they were a family,